Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Down Syndrome Center podcast. As always, I am your host, Dr. Kishore Velody. And yet again, another emailer has sent us a question that we are so excited to answer because we probably have touched on this topic several times within the podcast, but never as specifically as this particular person was asking in the question. Now, the question is going to be related to behavioral concerns that this mom had with her child. And so I'm so glad to have with me from our very own Down Syndrome Center team here in Pittsburgh, Dr. Tarin Santamaria, who is our behavioral psychologist. Tarin, why don't you say hello to our podcast audience? I know you've been on the podcast before, but tell us a little bit about what you do for us and why you love doing it.
Of
or at
course.
least I hope you love doing it.
Yes, of course. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Tarin Santamaria. I am a licensed psychologist and a state and nationally certified school psychologist. My position in the Down Syndrome Center is the psychologist. In my position, I do psychological evaluations and outpatient therapy for our kiddos and young adults. I often target behavioral concerns, consultation with parents, emotional and social needs, educational advocacy, and I offer sessions through telehealth or in person. So even if you're not close to our centers in Allegheny County, telehealth is always a good option as well. So come and see me.
We are so glad to have you on the team. Obviously you would not know, but there once was a time before we had behavioral supports in our center. And boy, it was not where it is today in terms of where we need to be. And so we are so glad to have you on the team and so glad that you're here to answer this question. So yes. I'm going to summarize a little bit and try to keep out any kind of identifiers. But I want to share with you the concerns that this mom had and kind of run through how you would think about approaching this in our behavioral clinic. So, so this mom, of course, started off, I want to say, she said she loves our podcast, which is great. And she's so grateful for all she's learned. She has a son who is 5 years old and has had issues with kind of throwing objects his whole life. And it seems to be escalating. He's throwing a lot of things, anything you want, dishes, toys, books, all these types of things are getting thrown. It's happening at home. It's happening at school. They're trying to ignore the behavior, but sometimes the breaking of glass and things like that will be quite startling to the family. And then to add on top of it, it sounds like there's a baby coming into this home. And so the family is worried about whether this behavior could potentially even harm the sibling. They've talked with teachers, talked with therapists, but really wanted to get our idea of how we would approach this. So Tarin, let me start off with that. What would be your initial approach? How would you assess the situation?
Sure. So I referred to this when we talked on another podcast about behaviors in school. The first thing when I hear about a behavior and I try to conceptualize it in my brain, I think about the functions or the why. Why is this behavior occurring? Because how we approach it or design interventions or come up with strategies, it depends on the why. So for throwing in particular, the ones that I think of are, okay, is this a developmental behavior? I am kind of exploring my environment. Is it sensory? Like, am I getting sensory input from throwing? Is it related to communication needs? Is it a way of expressing frustration? Or is it potentially attention seeking? Sometimes it can start as one of these things and change to another. So maybe it started off as sensory seeking and became attention seeking. Or it kind of be a combination, or it could be a different reason at different times. So really trying to observe the behavior, figure out why it's happening, and then we can explore strategies. So if you'd like, I can go through some ideas for each of those.
I would love it. Yeah, I think, and obviously we don't know all the specifics of this particular situation. And so I would love to kind of hear your general kind of, how you would approach each of those potential possibilities.
Yeah. So when I think about developmental stage, like really young kiddos, like maybe under the age of 2. So kiddos are exploring kind of like cause and effect. We're going to throw things and see what happens. So what to do in those situations? Obviously, we're going to help our kids explore. We might describe, oh, you're throwing the blue block. When it hits the floor, it crashes. And then you may try to set some limits too, because we don't want our kiddos to, we don't want to promote throwing in all instances. Like maybe with some items, it's okay. But eventually we're going to want to set some limits and boundaries. So eventually you might start saying things like, oh, if you throw that again, I'm going to have to take it away. But those developmental stages, it is something that we see a lot, not a big deal, I guess. So help the child explore, but then set some limits too.
Okay, so that younger age kind of group. Okay.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
For sensory, so when I think about sensory seeking behaviors, this is a child who is seeking inputs. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes, for example, for throwing, it might be the crash sound or the heavy input on the joints or the muscles, but they're doing it in a way that maybe is not ideal for you at your house. And so how do we figure out how to get the kid that same input, but in a more appropriate or potentially less destructive way? So I think about replacement activities a lot. So throwing items in a container. So giving the child empty plastic cups and letting them throw it into an empty bucket or plastic laundry basket. So maybe they can hear the clank noise, but it's not going to be your coffee mug full of hot coffee that they're swiping off the counter. So any way to get that same feeling, that same noise, but it's not ideal items. Another idea might be like cornhole, beanbag toss, throwing items at a target. If it's heavy input, then maybe doing like crab walk or heavy pushing of heavy items. When it's sensory, I also think, consulting with your OT is a really good idea. Occupational therapists, this is their wheelhouse. So any type of sensory activities, they have a huge repertoire of ideas that we can tap into. So if you have an OT on your team, I would definitely consult with them about this.
That's awesome.
Yeah. For communication, a lot of our individuals struggle with expressive communication skills. And so if they are trying to let you know, I am all done, but they're showing you they are all done by throwing their plate and their fork, then we want to help practice and give communication skills. So this might be, being close by, preventing the throwing before it happens. Looks like you're done. Let me take that plate from you. Mm-hmm. If it does happen, we'll respond to it by, having them help you pick it up. But, teaching, I try to think about teaching in the area of skill deficit. So if there's a communication need, we're going to teach the communication skill that would indicate all done. So teaching the sign for all done, and then prompting the child. So modeling it to them and expecting them to do that, to show you that they are all done.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So frustration. So when our kiddos are mad, they are throwing items to show I am mad. And so in these instances, obviously intervening early, if you see that your child's starting to escalate, can you block items, get items away, bring your child to a place where there's, no unsafe objects around. Noticing and labeling their feelings like, oh, you seem mad because, you're clenching your fists or your face is red, and prompting for social or coping skills. Coping skills could be really helpful. So prompting to take deep breaths, we're going to teach those skills in a neutral moment, but then in the moment, it's okay to prompt for them. So teaching the sign for help, teaching coping skills, labeling feelings, that would be how we teach in the area of skill deficit. And then in the moment, we could ask them, oh, do you need help? You seem angry. Can we do squeeze the lemons as a coping skill I use a lot with our population. And hopefully that'll help so that the child, instead of throwing items, then is able to advocate for themselves and express themselves appropriately.
What is squeeze the lemons? I'm sorry if I missed that one. I didn't learn that one in medical school.
It's a coping skill where you essentially hold up your arms and you squeeze your fists and pretend like you have lemons in your hands and you're squeezing out the juice. I have some friends that I see through the Down Syndrome Center that instead of lemons, they want it to be cheeseburgers. And so we'll say, squeeze the cheeseburgers. And I always say squeeze it for 5 seconds. And then you kind of shake out your hands and do spirit fingers. Yeah. And that's a coping skill that we use a lot. The kiddos seem to be into that. So it's motivating to use.
You were talking about communication and frustration. I wonder sometimes if there maybe is a little overlap there. Is there a benefit that you've seen or that you would employ with using a picture exchange type of thing where it has different pictures of different emotions being displayed by somebody, and they could point at what they're feeling maybe. Would that be helpful?
Yeah. So sometimes they'll have like feeling charts or pictures of faces that show different emotions. And so you can teach, obviously not in the moment. So like when the child is frustrated and is throwing items, you don't want to be like, oh, this is a happy face or this is a frustrated face, because it's not a teachable moment. Sure. But in a neutral moment, I think it's a really good idea to practice, to teach what each of those things means, what it might look like in that individual or in you, and then what you would do in those instances, like the coping skills.
Okay. And I think you had mentioned attention seeking. And I think that I definitely want to hear your approach and how it's common. Yes, and because how some of the approaches we've even been discussing so far could be unintentionally reinforcing if this is attention-seeking behavior. So give me your thoughts on that.
Okay, so when throwing is attention-seeking, what you might notice is the throwing happens in the presence of an audience, which may be a parent or a sibling or grandparent or teacher, and it's throwing, and you might notice that the individual like looks at you and wants to see like, oh, are you going to get upset because I just chuck this across the room? In those instances, what we want to do is planned ignoring, which means we are going to planfully ignore this behavior. We are not going to give the mommy stare, the daddy finger. We're going to, not look, not make a facial expression, not say anything. Because if we say, even saying like, don't throw, that could inadvertently reinforce or accidentally cause that to happen more, because even though it was a negative response from the adult, it's still a response. So it's still attention. So we want to use planned ignoring. We want to ignore things that we don't want to see again. And we want to give tons of attention to what we do want to see again, like as a general rule. So if it's attention seeking, use planned ignoring. There's going to be times where we cannot ignore. So for example, in the example that you gave, where there might be a baby coming to the family soon, if our individual is throwing stuff at the baby, we cannot use planned ignoring and turn our backs and not respond, because the baby may be in danger. Yes. So we're going to use what Dr. Stein, a psychologist from Boston Children's, had coined the respond but don't react method. So what would be best in that situation is to ignore the throwing, but we're going to respond by getting the baby, taking them to safety, which might be just picking up the baby, moving into a different room, but still ignoring the throwing. And that's really important, because if there's potential for unsafe behavior, we always have to respond. We can't use planned ignoring. So when I think about teaching in the area of skill deficit, in this instance, it would be to teach how to gain attention appropriately. So that might be greeting, tapping somebody on the shoulder or the arm, making eye contact, gesturing with a wave. How do I get the adult's attention in the appropriate way that does not include doing these inappropriate behaviors just to get a reaction? Yeah.
And so when they would do that desired behavior, then we would draw attention to, wow, I love it when you wave at me. Yes. It gets my attention so well, or something like that.
Great job tapping my arm. What can I help you with? Like big, excited reactions, tons of praise. I always talk about labeled praise. So not just saying good job, but saying, I really like how you did this, so that they know exactly what it was that they did well.
Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. Anything else? Any other thoughts or approaches? I think this is really great. And obviously, again, any number of these or combination of these things may be what's specifically going on in this particular child. We don't know. Right. We would have to have a full assessment for that. But anything else you would want to make sure that we would address today?
Yeah, I mean, I think some other things to consider, when we design those types of interventions, depending on the function, we're kind of on the defense. So when I think about like, how do we get on the offense? It's teaching in the areas of skill deficit outside of that situation. So again, teaching help, all done, gestures, how to gain attention. Some other things too is that I've noticed in some of the kids that we've seen through the center is, when they don't have functional play skills, sometimes they gravitate towards non-functional things or some of the inappropriate behaviors to fill their time. So I think that teaching functional play, which is playing with items and toys the way they were designed to be played with, sometimes that's not something that comes necessarily naturally. So teaching our kiddos how to play with blocks and dolls, and also like imaginative play. How do we play kitchen or doctor with superheroes? Because when our kids are bored and not engaging independently with play, sometimes they kind of divert to these attention seeking or other types of behaviors that are not desirable.
Wonderful. And now feel free, even in the midst of our thousands of podcast listeners, to tell me if I'm wrong. But one thing that I've often found as a sibling myself to somebody with Down syndrome is that rewarding desired behaviors from the sibling can sometimes be a motivator for the child with Down syndrome to follow those expectations as well. Is that something that you would ever talk about? Not shaming the child, of course, who's not doing it right, but praising the child who is. What do you think?
So sometimes I call this having like a built-in positive peer model. So when you have a sibling and they're doing something that you really like, or that you want the individual with Down syndrome to also be doing, you could say, oh, because sure, I really like when you sit nicely in your chair with your bum in the chair. And then that individual with Down syndrome may hear that, oh, well, like they're getting tons of adult attention for having their bum in the chair. I should put my bum in the chair too. You know, so it's like the positive peer model. They're modeling what you want to see, and the parent gives praise. And so then the kid sees that and wants to also do that.
Yeah, we talk about that sometimes in clinic. Before we send them over your way, we'll sometimes say, try that. And even with toileting, toilet training, that kind of stuff, that can be a real motivator for a lot of the kids too. But that's great. I really appreciate how you kind of walked us through the thought process here. I feel like we've touched on most things. Is there something more that we should be letting this particular person know, or anyone else who has similar type issues with their kids, maybe throwing stuff?
Well, come see me in the center.
There you go. Okay.
Not necessarily specific strategies, but just going back to, you know, my purpose in the center. You can schedule an appointment with me by calling the Down Syndrome Center, 412-692-7963. Option 1, you can speak with Camille, and you can get on my schedule the first appointment. It's considered a psych eval, which is just me gathering background information, getting to know you, getting to know what the concerns are for your individual. And then we can set up some outpatient therapy, which would be, you know, behavioral consultation, giving strategies and ideas. Then you can run and try to implement them, and we can meet again and kind of problem solve.
Yes. And so for our local families that are, you know, within the region, we would be happy to help serve you in that way. If it's been many years since you've had a medical evaluation through our center, we often will try to get that done before we would have you go see Dr. Santamaria, because there are sometimes medical issues that can masquerade and show itself as behavioral changes. And so we would want to make sure that a full medical evaluation was done, and then we would be able to get you referred over to Dr. Santamaria that way. If you're a regular coming to our center already, then it's very, very easy to call, just like Dr. Santamaria was just saying, and get set up for an appointment. But yeah, we are so grateful to have your services in our center, because it was definitely not as ideal before, and now having you as that resource is so wonderful. So thank you for that. And you are still, I believe, at least the way that our restrictions in the COVID pandemic are, but you're still able to see patients virtually as well, I believe, within the state. Right?
As long as you're within the state of Pennsylvania, I can do telehealth or virtual appointments. If you're outside of the state of Pennsylvania, it does have to be in person at one of our centers. So I'm at the main hospital in Bridgeville, which is our south location, and in Wexford at Pine Center.
Wonderful. Yeah. Well, thank you again. And thank you to our listener who sent this wonderful question. We definitely would love to get more and more questions that come in, because that's the way we know that this podcast is reaching the people that we want it to reach. So please don't hesitate to reach out at Down Syndrome Center at chp.edu. Send us your questions. It really does direct the way that we're moving forward in this podcast, because as I look back, I think we've covered so many different topics, and then a parent will send a message and it'll remind me, hey, we haven't specifically addressed that yet. So please do. If you would like to join us in the mission of this center, including the podcast, please do go to givetochildrens.org/Down Syndrome Center. We would love to partner with you and are so grateful for all of you who have partnered with us in that way. But until next time, bye-bye.